groups. I need to lower that a little, so that you gave a clue that the voice mightn't be carrying too well. How's it going in the back row? Is that all right? Good. Many of them, of course, took part in the door-knocking campaigns in which thousands of signatures were collected for petitions in support of constitutional amendment. The largest petition, containing 11,000 signatures, more than 11,000 signatures, was presented to Parliament in August 1894. And when reading the microfilm copy of this petition in the State Archives, I found the names of several nurses who were prominent in nursing leadership in that decade. These were important years of developments in nursing, which was an occupation already clearly identified with women. And I wasn't really surprised to find that there were women who were at the forefront of changes in nursing were supportive of changes in the status of women that the Constitutional Amendment Bill promoted. Before I look in more detail at three of these nursing pioneers, I'd like to speak briefly about the health services in that period, Adelaide in the 1890s. At that time, about 40% of the state's population of some 300,000 people lived in the city and suburbs of Adelaide. And although it was still probably a relatively youthful society, sickness was certainly no rare event. When they succumbed to sickness or accident or infection or some systemic disorder, most sufferers were nursed at home by members of the family. And for those who needed hospital care, there was the Adelaide Hospital, which had already served the community for 53 years, the 10-year-old, or just a more than 10-year-old children's hospital, several small private hospitals, 2 mental hospitals, and the hospital wards of the Destitute Asylum. Apart from the mental hospitals where male attendants cared for the male patients, female nurses generally formed the nursing staff under the supervision of a matron. And the few records that I've found of hospitals in the earlier years reveal, in some cases anyway, that the efforts of the nurses appointed to administrative posts weren't always viewed as having been successful. However, by the 1890s, things were changing. And there were, as I've mentioned already, nurses who gave strong and effective leadership, laying the foundations for the development of a nursing profession. When I speak of these nurses, I'll link, if I can, the characteristics that they displayed with those which were also prominent in their sisters in the suffrage movement. Again, by way of a preliminary, I'd just like to speak briefly on the term profession, which is sometimes a rather emotive word. It's used fairly loosely today in reference to vocations requiring knowledge in some department of learning or science, and it's usually associated with claims for recognition and status among the members of certain occupational groups. At the time at which we're speaking, back in the 1890s, nursing, the medical and legal professions were already established, and nursing was actually aspiring to this status in Britain. I think to understand the concept of professionalism at that time, I've referred to the work of Flexner, an American educator, and in his 1910 study of the criteria for professionalism, he noted that, firstly, the activities of professionals required the use of special knowledge. Secondly, the activities had a definite practical purpose. The techniques could be communicated in an orderly, systematic way. The members formed a unit around which their social and personal lives were organised, and they were concerned with the good of the community and not just with pecuniary interests. Well, by the 1890s, some degree, and I have to say some degree, of formal education in nursing had been established, and one can appreciate that nurses might see that it was to their advantage to pursue professional status, and indeed this was happening on a worldwide scale. The first formal education for nurses is usually considered to have taken place in St Thomas's Hospital, London, in a scheme which was financed from the Nightingale Fund after the Crimean War and was supervised by Florence Nightingale herself, by remote control, I might say. New South Wales had the benefit of nurses from the Nightingale School from 1867 onwards. But there's little evidence in South Australia of the influence of nurses who had trained in the British system until certainly the late 1870s. In 1879, actually, when the Children's Hospital opened, its first matron was a woman who we understood had received training in the care of sick children in Britain. She remained at the Children's Hospital for less than a year, and she was replaced by a nurse from New South Wales, of whose work the reports are not entirely favourable. But the three women who are the subject of my paper all received their nursing training in South Australia. And the first was a lady named Alice Tibbets. She was 25 years old and a recent immigrant from Staffordshire when she was engaged as the first of two nurses to undertake a one-year course of training introduced at when the Children's Hospital opened. It actually opened in August of 1876 was founded in August. It opened in August of 1879, and a few months later, before the end of the year, these two women had been appointed to the staff to undertake a training. Alice Tibbets had come to South Australia a few months earlier with her friends, the Cowdrey family, from Walsall in the English Midlands. Joseph Cowdrey had left his foundry to try his fortune in the new colony, and Alice Tibbets was a close friend of Joseph's sister-in-law, Kate Hill, who was also a member of this newly arrived group. The Children's Hospital itself was established as the outcome of the efforts of a small group of Adelaide citizens to provide a hospital in which sick children could receive specialised medical and nursing attention. Until this time, most sick children were nursed at home, but the Adelaide Hospital had to receive those who needed hospital care. Can you imagine it? In 1874, the Adelaide Hospital admitted over 200 children in the course of an epidemic. And not surprisingly, it was considered an inappropriate place for children. Some doctors were certainly openly critical of the standards of nursing. So the new hospital in North Adelaide was a very welcome development. It opened on the 6th of August with, I quote, a fanfare of trumpets and bunting that stretched halfway across Rowan Place. And in November, its staff of 2 trained nurses, as I've already said, was augmented by the admission of 2 trainees, one of whom was Alice Tibbets. The other one was a lady named Louisa Halthouse, but her story, as far as I can discover, has not been preserved. From the outset, the trainee nurses at the Children's Hospital received instruction from doctors and the trained nurses, and their nursing experience included not only the care of sick children, but they also had maternity nursing through a process of secondment to the lying-in wards of the Destitute Asylum, which was not so far away in Kintore Avenue. The course of training was 1 year. Alice Tibbets seemed to have had a clear idea that nurses needed a broad education, and as soon as she'd finished the course at the Children's Hospital, she returned to England at her own expense, and she made arrangements to enter the London Hospital as a probationer. The training in adult nursing that she had there lasted for 2 years, after which she took a further 6 months course in midwifery. And then in 1885, she came back to Adelaide, where she undertook private nursing duties for Dr. William Gardner, who was a well-known physician. In 1888, a widow who was the matron of a small and well-regarded private hospital in Wakefield Street remarried, and Alice Tibbets purchased the hospital and set it up as a training school for nurses. The trained nurses for this hospital, as the trained nurses, she engaged nurses from her own training school, the Children's Hospital. During the next 10 years, Miss Tibbets applied herself to the expansion of the physical facilities of the hospital, the consolidation of the training school, and the development of services to meet particular needs, which included, interestingly, a home nursing service which was run from the hospital. She was involved in work which I'm sure occupied her for 10 to 12 hours a day, if not more, both as a practitioner and an administrator. So one doesn't look for her name amongst those who were actively involved in the suffrage movement. However, as a highly respected woman conducting her own business with conspicuous success, it's not surprising to find her name, with those of 8 of her trained nursing staff, in the document that showed to the members of Parliament, and I quote from the petition, that their petitioners were convinced of the absolute justice of giving women the franchise for both houses of Parliament on the same terms as men. So Alice Tibbets was certainly in support of that. I think I'll pause for a moment and show you just a few slides of Alice Tibbets and her nurses, and the Wakefield Street Hospital. You've seen this photograph already if you've read your brochure for this year, because it's the one that's been used for the year's calendar. Here's Alice Tibbets, and around her, and the photograph would have been taken in the mid-1890s, around her are a group of her trained nurses and student nurses. I think there's a second slide which is an enlargement, and yes, just gives us a little closer view of Miss Tibbets herself, dressed in the uniform which was customary for that time in British hospitals, and which had well and truly been adopted by the nurses in Australia over the previous 10-year period. Right, the next one, thanks, Joan. Just another photograph of another Wakefield Street nurse. This was of a trainee nurse at Wakefield Street. Interesting to see the armband, which, if you can see it in more detail, shows the letters W-S-P-H. I think they always used to call it, in fact, the private hospital Wakefield Street, not Wakefield Street Private Hospital, as we intended to do later. And this interesting item of nurses' equipment, which has got, I think at the bottom is a large felt badge in the shape of a Maltese cross with again the hospital emblem on it, but in the little chatelaine that she carried here would be her thermometer and her scissors and her probes and pencils and various things that she might need in the course of a day's work, which came out of the pocket and were used on the job. The nurse, incidentally, is the grandmother of some present-day Adelaide doctors. Her name was Kate Gilmore, and she became Kate Gilmore Reid, a very well-known physiotherapist, after she had completed her training as a nurse, undertook physiotherapy training. I think there is just one more in that group. Yes, this is an interesting one of the care of patients. It's considerably later than the period of which we're talking. It's about 1920. But the Wakefield Street Hospital is not where we see it now, on the corner of Hutt Street and Wakefield Street. It was further down Wakefield Street, and I regret that I haven't yet been to the records to find out precisely which building, because no one at Wakefield Street Hospital can tell me where it was. But one of the former matrons certainly told me in an interview that it was a little distance. I take it to be somewhere on the site of the Christian Brothers College. And it was a series of smaller single and double-storey buildings with a nice garden, and it was very customary for the patients to be carried downstairs. Well, some of them were downstairs already, some of them had to be carried from upstairs downstairs on little tiny stretchers. The nurses carried them, one at each end of the stretcher, and then brought out onto beds in the garden. And what's the word for it? Treatment in the fresh air and sunshine must be very much appreciated. Right, that's for all that group of slides. Thank you. Kate Hill was 4 years younger than her friend Alice, and she was admitted as a probationer at the Children's Hospital in 1883 at the age of 23, and that was a fairly customary age for beginning nursing training, generally not younger. Prior to coming to Australia, she had actually gained some experience of emergency nursing, having grown up in the Midlands town of Walsall, in which the legendary Sister Dora had established a hospital to provide treatment for workers injured in foundry accidents. As a candidate for admission, she wrote in memoirs later on that she had been interviewed by 3 ladies, including Mrs. Colton, who was later, some of you will recall, an active member of the women's suffrage campaign. During her first weeks as a trainee, she was tempted to give up because of the long hours, the poor food and the hard work, but she survived. And she probably experienced, along with her fellow nurses, some deficiency in the already established program of instruction, particularly in practical nursing. For the hospital records show that in October 1884, the subcommittee of the Board of Management asked the matron to give more attention to the nurses' education. And when the matron failed to rise to the board's expectations, the matron resigned early in 1885. Kate Hill had actually been appointed to a charge nurse position in the previous year, and her promotion continued when, in 1887, she was put in charge of nursing throughout the hospital with the title of head nurse. But in 1889, she was determined to gain wider experience in nursing and administration, and this led her not overseas, but to Miss Tibbets Hospital in Wakefield Street. And here, as the assistant to the matron, she spent 15 months, and then returned to the Children's Hospital in 1891 to take the post of a new title, Superintendent of Nurses. Kate Hill's domain steadily increased as the hospital grew to meet the need for more accommodation for sick children. The Children's Hospital historian, Margaret Barbalet, describes the decade of the 1890s as the hospital's halcyon years. Although in the early 90s the effects of an economic depression curtailed plans for building extensions, generous benefactors soon came forward. In 1894, the Angus building, with its frontage to King William Road, was opened, and additional facilities that it provided allowed for the hospital's cot capacity to be doubled. By the end of the decade, the Campbell building, a little further down King William Road, had been added. And these two grey stone buildings still stand amongst the newer and taller structures of the Children's Hospital as we see it today. Kate Hill's reputation as an administrator remained high, and she built up a very loyal and efficient team of nurses. By 1895, there were 6 junior and 6 senior nurses. It was a 2-year training at this stage, and there were 3 charge nurses. In 1898, the training period was further extended to 3 years, in keeping with changes in hospitals in Australia and overseas. Towards the end of the century, Kate Hill became aware of the formation of an association for nurses in New South Wales. And after entering into correspondence with the newly formed New South Wales Nurses Association, which was actually soon renamed the Australasian Trained Nurses Association, she became the South Australian Recording Secretary. In 1905, a branch of that association was formed in Adelaide at a meeting chaired by another well-known suffragist, Mrs. Rosa Burks. The new branch soon adopted the standards for training schools which had been established by the parent body in New South Wales. And Kate Hill and Alice Tibbets together gave many years to the association's affairs as members of its executive. In 1902, Kate Hill had decided to leave her post at the Children's Hospital and to take up the offer of partnership in the Wakefield Street Private Hospital. And in fact, a year later, she took Alice Tibbets' place when Alice Tibbets retired in 1903. At the time of leaving the Children's Hospital, Kate Hill was accorded the singular honour of being invited to take a position on the Board of Management, a post which she continued to occupy for the next 20 years. At the time of her resignation as matron, this is in 1902, the board of the Children's Hospital recorded their appreciation of Miss Hill's zeal, fidelity, diligence and kindness, and of her ability to educate and to command her subordinates without alienating them. Very good qualities to have. In some respects, one can't really compare her with the suffragists since she worked in an entirely different sphere. Nevertheless, she demonstrated, at least she does to me, how effectively a woman could give leadership and apply administrative skills and work as a partner to doctors and others concerned with child health. I've no doubt she experienced setbacks in attaining her visions for nursing, but she didn't seem to let them overwhelm her. One can picture the welcome that she gave to the representatives of the women's suffrage movement who called to seek signatures for the petition. Perhaps it was Lady Colton herself, one of the founders of the hospital and one of the leaders of the suffragists, who brought the petition to Kate Hill. The petition bears the names not only of Kate Hill, but of 2 of her charge nurses, 2 trainee nurses, 1 doctor, and 7 others who I don't actually identify as nurses, but they certainly gave their address as the Children's Hospital, Adelaide. I think we'll have the rest of the slides now, Brian, before going on to the third of the nursing pioneers that I'll speak about, Margaret Gray. Well, that is a photograph of Kate Hill, a young Kate Hill, probably in the early years of taking her appointment as the Superintendent of Nurses at the Children's Hospital. Thank you. And there she is again. They had marvellous photography, didn't they, in the 1890s? And here's Kate Hill and a number of her nurses. I happen to know that that one was a lady named Helena Abbott. And her daughter identified the photo for me and said, Mother always had her head on one side. But it's a photograph of the, I think most, no, well, we understand that she only had 3 or 4 trained nurses, so that there's a mixture of trained and trainee. It's not very easy to distinguish them. There were probably some distinguishing features regarding the group. Thank you. That's a later photograph of Kate Hill in her sitting room, probably, where she would have done most of her administrative work. A nice intimate photograph of the interior of a late Victorian ladies' place of work. That's the earliest building, the oldest building of the hospital, facing Sir Edwin Smith Avenue, and it has long since been demolished. But it was the first building that was erected. It had 4 wards, each with 6 beds in them, and the other rooms there were allocated for the small nursing staff and for other necessary purposes in the hospital. That's the interior of a ward in the Children's Hospital. Maybe some special occasion. It's certainly very thoroughly decorated. And I had an interesting story from one of the much more recent matrons. Well, she became the matron she went back on the staff in 1933 as the assistant to a new matron, and she was most embarrassed to discover that all of these little stands which had been attached to the cots had become bent over through disuse and abuse, and she quickly had them removed rather than have such unsightly things in the ward. Yes, that one shows that it was back to front, but I don't know whether it matters all that much. Thanks, Brian. We'll have the next one. Oh, well, so now we're going to leave the Children's Hospital and come on. I thought I'd show the slides now rather than leave them till the end. These slides relate to the third of the people whom I'm speaking about, matron Margaret Graham, and the third hospital, which is the Adelaide Hospital. And this is a photograph of the Adelaide Hospital, as it probably was in the 1890s. Demolished in the 1960s to make place for the great boxes that occupy that site now. Another view, this is a little bit later because there are 2 motor cars, so that one must have been more like the early 20s, I think. 30s, would you say? By the look of those? Okay, I won't. Surely taken on a Sunday morning, except the only thing that would make it not Sunday morning is that there's no sign of the Salvation Army band playing in full tone. But this goes back to the 1890s, and this is a ward which was actually opened in 1891, and it's just back in front, but I think it's Flinders Ward. There are two identical wards, one above the other, and the doctor seated here, the nurse giving him information, no doubt. Yes, that's very interesting, because it's obviously a female ward. It wasn't always so, but perhaps in those early days, come to think of it, the downstairs ward was a female ward and the men's ward was upstairs. But a typical appearance of what was often known as the Nightingale type of ward. Wonderful, because you had a full view from the nursing staff's point of view. You could see what was going on through the whole ward at any moment, from any point in it. The person about whom I'm going to speak now is Margaret Graham, who was a matron for 22 years, and she's there in that photograph with a group of her nurses. That was actually post-1900. It was, I've dated it to 1909 actually, because I discovered that this was Dr. Cowan, and he was a house surgeon at the hospital in 1909. So it was, but Margaret Graham, I'm speaking about Margaret Graham in the 1890s, but she did in fact spend most of her matronship in between the period of 1900 to 1920. Another photograph of the interior, this again was Margaret Graham's sitting room and office, and 2 of her nurses, perhaps one may appear to be doing a little work there, the other one may have come to give a report, although they all look pretty posed to me anyway. I don't think any active work was going on at that moment. Is that the last of them? Oh no, just one more. A group of nurses at the turn of the century in the outdoor walking out uniform that nurses wore. They were on duty, of course, for so many hours a day and so many hours a week that when they did have an hour or 2 off, it was satisfactory to be able to throw a cloak over your uniform and a cap on your head and go out for a short time. And so there they are. It's an authentic photograph. The nurse who sent it to me was able to identify her grandmother and other nurses in that photograph. It wasn't just a dress-up one as we've seen some more recently. I just popped that one in as a final farewell to Margaret Graham, whom we haven't even begun to talk about yet. But she is seen in that photograph in 1921 in Frome Road at the steps of the present Margaret Graham Nurses' Home, which wasn't named until 20 years later in her honour. and she's being farewelled as she set off for the Outer Harbour to go home to Carlisle, where she lived the last 20 years of her life. So that's the rest of the slides, thank you, and I'll just fill you in quite quickly. 15 minutes, I hope, all right, on the story of Margaret Graham. Margaret Graham did not sign the petition, although I looked for her name there, but when I didn't find it, I began to think why it wasn't there, and I realised that, firstly, at the time of the collection of signatures for that petition, she was a trainee nurse, a probationer nurse, although that's not necessarily the reason why, because there were probationer nurses from other hospitals who signed. But I think probably members of the staff of the government hospital weren't expected to petition the government, and so that may explain why there's not a single address of Adelaide Hospital amongst the 11,000 as far as I can discover. However, Margaret Graham showed in other ways her alignment with the suffragists. This 31-year-old woman entered the Adelaide Hospital as a probationer in May 1891. She was born in Carlisle in Cumberland, but little else has been established about her early life or of her arrival in South Australia. In 1891, the year that she began her training, the Adelaide Hospital was developing, the training school for nurses rather, was developing under the supervision of a matron who trained at the London Hospital. Until a year or two previously, there had been no formal training. The Children's Hospital had been doing a good job for 10 years before the Adelaide Hospital got into the business of providing any sort of training for nurses. However, in October of 1891, that matron resigned several months before the expiry of her 3-year term, and the remainder of Nurse Graham's training was supervised by another matron who also came from the London Hospital. Late in 1894, just as she was finishing her training, there was a further change in nursing administration, and this time the government directed the board to make its appointment of a matron from within rather than from outside the existing staff, an instruction which was probably related to the economic constraints of the 1890s. Margaret Graham's story I find of great interest, particularly in relation to a concern for the rights of women. It's a very complex story, and it's set within the latter 6 years of the 19th century in a hospital in which a dispute of far-reaching proportions arose. The dispute was ostensibly over the objection by members of the nursing staff to a senior nursing appointment. The factors which influenced both its duration and ferocity included the personality of the colony's premier, C.C. Kingston, the resistance of the Board of Management to increasing government intervention in the running of the hospital, and the stand taken by, I quote, an independent, spirited and capable nurse who was uncowed by traditional male authority. End of quote. In October 1894, Margaret Graham had recently completed her training, and she received a temporary appointment as a night charge nurse. It meant that just simply meant a trained nurse on night duty. There were 2 or 3 nurses on night duty. At the same time, the hospital board appointed as superintendent of night nurses, and this was the second most senior nursing post in the hospital, a nurse who was junior to 14 other charge nurses. This appointment was made on the recommendation of the medical superintendent in consultation with a new matron. But a group of nurses who signed themselves charge nurses protested to the board that the appointment was unjust and that it overlooked the potential of many, 14 indeed, more experienced nurses. The board dismissed the protest, but in the meantime, one of the nurses made the case known to the Premier, who sought further explanations from the board. When this nurse was reprimanded by the board for such temerity, 6 charge nurses came to her defence, and one of them was Margaret Graham. The board dealt summarily with the protesters, requiring them to retract their complaints. But Margaret Graham and another charge nurse refused to do so, and as a result they were dismissed from the hospital service. The row therefore began as a dispute between the board and the nurses over an appointment to the nursing staff, but it tended to widen fairly quickly. And in its development, the real issues became obscured, and as one commentator said, bruised egos came to dominate its course. I'm not going to follow the course of the whole row, but just follow Margaret Graham through it. At the time of her dismissal, the Chief Secretary and the hospital's medical superintendent offered her positions in other hospitals, so they didn't think she was all that bad. But she refused, and she denounced them publicly as bribes for silence. In the 12 months following her dismissal, Margaret Graham's faith in herself and in her decision to stand out against bureaucratic power must have been severely tested. She endeavoured to find work in the private sphere, but the doctors who knew of her involvement in the hospital row, as it became known, refused to have her to nurse their patients. In 6 months, she had only 10 weeks of private employment. The commission appointed by the government to inquire into the nurses' problem issued a progress report in May of 1895. The commissioners, who included 4 members of Parliament, 1 doctor, Dr. McGarry, and the social reformer Catherine Helen Spence, found that 1. In appointing a junior charge nurse to the role of superintendent of night nurses, an undeserved reflection had been cast upon the more senior charge nurses. Secondly, it considered that the appointment of the superintendent of night nurses had nevertheless been made in good faith, and the appointee 6 months later shouldn't be deprived of her post. It also found that the nurses who had protested had done so in the interest of the senior charge nurses, but while regarding their protest as justified, they considered that the words which were used were not well chosen. And on withdrawal of the offensive words against the government and the board, the nurses should be reinstated. The board, however, found ways of evading the issue. They reinstated 1 nurse, but they evaded the issue of Margaret Graham's reinstatement, despite the receipt of her letter withdrawing certain expressions used in her correspondence, because it simply deleted the post of night charge nurse to which she had earlier been appointed, and then it claimed that there was no place for her. Her continuing correspondence with the press and the publication in daily papers of her correspondence with the government, because most government correspondence seemed to find its way into the papers, no doubt did nothing to soften the attitudes of the board. At the end of February 1896, the term of office of the board expired. They had a 3-year term of office. The government now took the upper hand, and in an interval between the retirement of the old board and the appointment of a new one, it reinstated Margaret Graham to the nursing staff. Her reinstatement had the effect of precipitating the resignation of the matron and of the nurse appointed to fill the matron's place, while for Margaret Graham itself, it simply led to her appointment as a charge nurse, a post which she occupied without, obviously, too much trouble to anyone else for the next 2 years. But I think those 2 years were nevertheless an unhappy time for the Adelaide Hospital. The government, in its appointment of a new board of management, had seriously displeased the honorary medical staff. Not surprisingly, they objected when they learnt that they were to have no representation on the board. They objected to the appointment to the board of a certain representative of the medical profession whose qualifications and character they were critical of, and they objected to the reinstatement of Margaret Graham, whom they considered to be the source of all the trouble. They showed their displeasure by resigning, an act which disadvantaged not only the hospital, but the University Medical School, which was forced to close, and remained closed for a further 5 years. For the nursing staff, the remaining years of the decade must have been particularly difficult. There were many resignations from among the charge nurses and the probationers, and this would have had an adverse effect on the ratio of experienced to non-experienced nurses. In December of 1897, the matron who had been, against her will almost, asked to take office after the resignation of several others, herself resigned, and the board then wished to call for applications from throughout the colonies. But the Chief Secretary again advised that the policy of the government was to exhaust the possibilities within the service before advertising outside. So the board then resolved to seek applications from nurses in the government hospitals in South Australia. How many applications do you think it received? It did receive 1, and that was the application of Margaret Graham. And so on the 1st of January 1898, she took up her appointment as the superintendent of nurses. The beginning of Margaret Graham's term of office was anything but propitious, though she probably had some idea of the nature of the problems that lay ahead. She had already weathered the storms of perceived injustice, dismissal, isolation, ostracism by some members of the medical profession, and suspicion by some of her peers at the time of her reinstatement to the staff. She experienced initially lack of confidence in her leadership by nurses who had previously supported her. 5 of them resigned within a week of her appointment. There was a tremendous amount of rebuilding to restore the nursing staff to its earlier stability. However, she achieved this very early in the ensuing 20 years of her matronship. She also gained for the Adelaide Hospital's nursing staff recognition by the then prestigious nursing organisation, the Royal British Nurses Association, when she arranged for a branch of that association to be established in South Australia. And this itself was instrumental in moving nursing towards the professional status that it was seeking. Margaret Graham's experiences differed considerably, as you will judge, from those of Alice Tibbets and Kate Hill, but there are some common features. In 1890, all three were relatively recent immigrants to South Australia. They came from what I would judge to be middle class, or perhaps in Margaret Graham's case, a working class home in the Midlands or the north of England, and they all became matrons of important hospitals in Adelaide in that decade. They all developed aspirations for a strong and effective nursing service in South Australia. The ways in which they attained their objectives differed, influenced no doubt by differences in their personalities as well as by the circumstances in which they worked. But I find that their stories provide ample evidence that nurses played their part amongst a range of women who helped to bring about change in the status of women in the latter years of the 19th century.
Thanks very much, Joan. Any questions?
Were they all single women? You said that they were. Yes, I mentioned one married woman, or a widow, who conducted the first Wakefield Street private hospital, and when she remarried, Alice Tibbets took that hospital over from her, moved to and set up Australia. But the three of whom I've been speaking particularly were single women, remained single, and in the case of Alice Tibbets and Kate Hill, remained in South Australia and died here. In the case of Margaret Graham, for reasons that I don't really know, she went home to England and was visited by many of her adoring nurses, because whilst she was such an interesting and unusual personality and ran into such a lot of strife with the powers that be, she certainly had a group of nurses who she had selected and trained ultimately, who held her in very high regard. And any whom I've spoken to who knew Miss Graham tend to say, "Oh, Miss Graham."
Did you also another interesting argument that was going on during the First World War?
Yes, I didn't mention her wartime experiences, but in fact she was the first matron to be appointed to the Army Nursing Reserve, which was set up after the Boer War in 1905, I think, or thereabouts. And then in 1914 she was called up as a member of the Army Nursing Reserve, was called up for the Army Nursing Service, was the first of three nurses to leave South Australia in October 1914 and served overseas for 4 years. She came back in 1918. From reading the minutes of the board of the Adelaide Hospital, I feel sure that the board heaved a sigh of relief when she went to the war. It wasn't an easy relationship, and reading between the lines, there were difficulties on both sides. But the only reference, one of the final references in the minutes is a reference in the middle of 1918 when Miss Graham was welcomed back to the hospital after 4 years overseas. Simple as that.
Am I right, did the Children's Hospital not take children under 2 years old for the first?
For many, many, many years, I think. Even, when I'm thinking up to the time of Dr. Helen Mayo, who had to set up a hospital for children in 1912, if I remember rightly. That was partly because of the fact that the Children's Hospital would not affect children under the age of 2 years. I guess there were people here who could probably explain what was the basis for that.
And I think that they just accepted that as a matter of course. I found last year that many of those women initiated changes to the hospital. Not quite a number of years. I think about 1925 when I read that nurses at the Adelaide Hospital were allowed to wear softer collars than those high collars which were up their necks. That's a long way out. They did a lot of enduring for me.
Any further questions?
With the Victoria Hospital and the problems of getting up in Victoria
That's right. 17, I think, or thereabouts, yes. Yes, I think that it was, it was Lady Tennyson who was instrumental in getting that hospital. Well, she certainly played a key role in the establishment of the hospital. I think was involved in the discussions about the establishment of that hospital. Prior to that, the only place, there were some private nursing homes where mothers could have their babies. The majority of women had their babies at home anyway. But there was the maternity wards, as I mentioned previously, at the lying-in hospital. The lying-in wards of the destitute asylum, I'm getting muddled up. But there was a limitation for people who could be accommodated there. Obviously, they had to be destitute. I guess it was in their intention that some of these women too would have had the benefit of Queen Victoria Hospital, but the regulations were drawn up that no unmarried woman could be admitted.
And then also no wealthy women.
Yes, they would have done a means test. It was limited in its scope for admission. I'm pleased to say this, one of my colleagues is undertaking a study of the history of midwifery in South Australia as a PhD thesis at the moment, and I think we might find out a lot more about the totality of midwifery from a nursing point of view when that work is completed. Well, yes, I think that was the case, and that is why these so-called professional organisations, the Australasian Nurses Association, the RBNA, were important in being able to claim to their, if people met their criteria and became members of those associations, they were really set apart from any who didn't have the necessary credentials. When those associations were established, I don't know so much about, well, the RBNA became very exclusive right from the outset. It was a British organisation, and the requirements for membership in Britain were that you must be trained in a hospital which had a minimum of 40 beds. The Adelaide Hospital was the only hospital in Adelaide with more than 40 beds for many, many, many years. And so it became an exclusive club almost for nurses who were trained at the Adelaide. But the Australian Trained Nurses Association was not quite so stringent in that regard, and at the outset it had special clause for admission to membership of those who had nursing experience but not a formal certificate of nursing training. And so quite eminent nurses in South Australia gained membership of the association from the fact that they hadn't either trained at the children's or waiting to the particular private hospital training school, but nevertheless had credentials and doctors who had vouched for their suitability of members, and so in that sense there was a senior conflict, and others wouldn't be able to gain recognition in that time. Yes.
Are those destroyed already?
Yes, that's right.
They were not far out.
No, I interviewed Miss Rowe a year or two before she died, and she told me about the moving day actually. So it obviously wasn't a difficult thing to move the patients from one hospital to another. And to say, looking at it now, I'd say it's somewhere in the newer buildings of the remote history. But when I asked another matron who had been there much more recently, just thought I was a verification with her. She said, oh, it's always been on this side. And I said, well, I know that it hasn't always been on this side. That's right. And most downs towards the back of those buildings, which comes down to quite close. One of the buildings was called Hudson, which is the name of its home in Wilson.
I thought the names to me was thank you very much for tonight's talk. I must admit that as a public servant of a few years, standing your life, I thought had many legends in it, and obviously some things don't change. I do think it's very tedious these days the way the press concentrates on the superficialities rather than the victory some of the major issues that the press did in those days, and just need to follow issues through. But I guess it happens occasionally still, but more often it's just knee-jerk reactions that all public servants waste money or abuse government cars, and any improvement to Parliament House is a bad thing, despite the conditions of politicians there. That very simple reaction that sort of gets from the press rather than the really worthwhile investigative work that they can do and supporting and so on. So cases like the one we heard about tonight. But thanks very much, Joan, for a very interesting contribution towards this suffrage centenary year, and I'll ask members to say their thanks once again.